Imagine picking up a smartphone in 2026 and realizing that for the first time in years, you are not locked into Android or iOS, not forced to accept an ecosystem that decides what you can install, how long your device will be supported, or how your data is handled. Imagine a phone that feels more like a personal computer in your pocket than a controlled appliance. That is exactly why Linux phones have reached a point where Android and iOS should genuinely be worried. This is not about a futuristic concept or a niche experiment anymore. This is about a slow but powerful shift that has been building for over a decade and is finally becoming visible to mainstream users. For a long time, the idea of Linux on phones sounded unrealistic to most people. Linux was seen as something for servers, developers, hackers, and desktop enthusiasts, not for everyday consumers. Meanwhile, Android and iOS shaped the smartphone world into a tightly controlled duopoly. Android marketed itself as open, but in reality it became deeply tied to Google services, proprietary frameworks, and locked bootloaders. iOS never even pretended to be open, building a premium experience inside a carefully guarded walled garden. Users accepted this trade-off because the alternatives were immature, slow, and lacked apps. That excuse is fading in 2026. Linux phones today are not trying to copy Android or iOS. They are offering something fundamentally different. They are offering real ownership of your device. On a Linux phone, the operating system is not a black box. The user can see it, modify it, replace it, and keep it running long after the manufacturer stops caring. This idea alone challenges the core business model of Android and iOS, which depends on planned obsolescence, forced upgrades, and ecosystem lock-in. One of the biggest reasons Android and iOS should be worried is that Linux phones are no longer limited to hobbyists. Devices like the PinePhone, Librem 5, and newer community-backed hardware have shown that you can ship a phone that runs mainline Linux, uses standard drivers, and receives updates just like a desktop Linux system. In 2026, this means something very important: long-term support. While Android phones often get 2 to 4 years of updates and iPhones maybe 5 or 6, Linux phones can theoretically receive updates for 10 years or more. As long as the hardware works, the software can keep evolving. This matters more than ever because people are tired of replacing perfectly functional phones just because software support ended. Environmental concerns, rising hardware prices, and economic uncertainty have changed user priorities. Linux phones align perfectly with this mindset. They treat the phone as a general-purpose computer, not a disposable gadget. That philosophy resonates strongly with power users, developers, privacy-conscious individuals, and increasingly with regular users who simply want their devices to last. Privacy is another major battlefield where Linux phones are gaining serious ground. Android and iOS both claim to care about privacy, but their business incentives tell a different story. Android is deeply connected to Google's advertising ecosystem, and iOS, while more restrictive, still relies on centralized app distribution and closed-source components that users cannot fully audit. Linux phones flip this model upside down. Most Linux-based mobile operating systems are open source from top to bottom. Users and developers can inspect the code, verify what the system is doing, and remove components they do not trust. In 2026, privacy is no longer a niche concern. Data breaches, surveillance scandals, and aggressive tracking have made people more aware of how much information their phones collect. Linux phones offer a level of transparency that Android and iOS simply cannot match without fundamentally changing their business models. When users realize they can have a phone that does not constantly phone home, that does not force cloud integration, and that allows full control over permissions at the system level, it becomes very hard to go back. Another key reason Linux phones are becoming a real threat is convergence. For years, the idea of using one device as both a phone and a desktop was talked about but rarely executed well. In 2026, Linux phones are finally delivering on this promise in a meaningful way. You can connect a Linux phone to a monitor, keyboard, and mouse and instantly get a desktop Linux environment. Not a limited desktop mode, but a real Linux desktop running the same applications you would use on a laptop or PC. This changes how people think about computing. Instead of carrying multiple devices, users can rely on a single pocket-sized computer for communication, productivity, and entertainment. Android tried this with desktop modes, and iOS largely ignored it, but both approaches remain restricted and tightly controlled. Linux phones embrace convergence as a core feature, not an afterthought. This makes them incredibly appealing to developers, students, freelancers, and anyone who values flexibility. The application ecosystem, once the weakest point of Linux phones, is also evolving rapidly. While it is true that Linux phones do not have native versions of every popular Android or iOS app, the gap is narrowing in unexpected ways. Progressive web apps have become far more powerful, allowing many services to run smoothly in the browser. Containerized Android environments on Linux phones allow users to run Android apps without giving up control of the underlying system. Native Linux applications are being adapted for mobile interfaces, creating a new category of software that feels fresh and powerful. This hybrid approach is dangerous for Android and iOS because it reduces their biggest advantage. If users can access essential apps, communicate with everyone they need, and get real productivity tools on a Linux phone, the question becomes not why switch, but why stay? The answer to that question is becoming less convincing every year. Performance is another area where Linux phones are quietly catching up. Early Linux phones were slow, buggy, and inefficient. In 2026, modern hardware combined with optimized Linux kernels has changed that narrative. Linux is already known for its efficiency on servers and desktops. That efficiency translates well to mobile devices when paired with proper power management and modern ARM processors. Linux phones can feel fast, responsive, and stable, especially for users who value consistency over flashy animations. Security is also a strong advantage. Linux's permission model, combined with open-source development, allows for rapid identification and fixing of vulnerabilities. While Android and iOS rely on centralized updates controlled by corporations, Linux phones benefit from community-driven security practices. When a vulnerability is discovered, it can be patched and distributed without waiting for a vendor's approval or a carrier's schedule. This decentralization makes the ecosystem more resilient. The cultural shift around technology is another reason Linux phones are gaining momentum. People are increasingly skeptical of big tech companies and their influence. There is a growing desire for digital independence, self-hosted services, and open platforms. Linux phones fit perfectly into this movement. They are not just devices, they are statements. Using a Linux phone in 2026 signals that you value control, transparency, and freedom over convenience imposed by corporations. Education and development communities are also playing a major role. Students learning programming, system administration, or cybersecurity find Linux phones incredibly valuable. They can experiment with real Linux environments, write scripts, compile software, and learn how operating systems work, all from their phones. This creates a new generation of users who are comfortable with Linux from an early age. As these users enter the workforce and influence purchasing decisions, the impact will be significant. Android and iOS should also be worried because Linux phones are not driven by a single company. There is no single point of failure. The ecosystem is decentralized, with multiple distributions, hardware vendors, and communities contributing to its growth. This makes it harder to suppress, buy out, or control. Even if one project fails, others continue. This resilience is something Android and iOS cannot easily replicate. In 2026, we are also seeing governments and organizations take interest in Linux-based mobile platforms. Concerns about national security, data sovereignty, and dependence on foreign tech giants have pushed some institutions to explore open-source mobile solutions. Linux phones offer the possibility of fully auditable systems that can be customized for specific needs. This institutional adoption, even at a small scale, adds legitimacy and funding to the ecosystem. The user experience on Linux phones has also improved dramatically. Modern mobile Linux interfaces are smoother, more intuitive, and more visually appealing than ever before. Gesture navigation, adaptive layouts, and responsive design are now standard. While they may not look exactly like Android or iOS, they do not need to. They offer a distinct experience that prioritizes functionality and customization over uniformity. Customization itself is a powerful differentiator. On a Linux phone, almost everything can be changed. From the bootloader to the desktop environment, from system services to the user interface, the phone adapts to the user, not the other way around. Android offers limited customization, and iOS offers almost none at the system level. Once users taste real customization, it is hard to accept artificial limitations. Battery life, often a concern with early Linux phones, has also improved. Better power management, optimized kernels, and efficient applications mean Linux phones can now compete with mainstream devices. While they may not always win on raw battery endurance, the gap is no longer a deal breaker, especially for users who value other benefits more. Another subtle but important factor is trust. Trust is hard to earn and easy to lose. Android and iOS have both faced criticism over policy changes, App Store restrictions, and sudden shifts in direction. Linux phones, being community-driven, build trust through transparency and consistency. Decisions are discussed openly, code changes are visible, and users are not treated as passive consumers. In 2026, the smartphone market is mature. Most people already have a phone that does what they need. Innovation is no longer about adding more cameras or slightly faster chips. It is about redefining the relationship between the user and the device. Linux phones offer a fundamentally different relationship, one based on ownership rather than permission. This does not mean Android and iOS are going to disappear overnight. They are deeply entrenched, with massive ecosystems and loyal user bases. But the existence of a credible alternative changes everything. It forces competition. It challenges assumptions, it gives users leverage. And history has shown that when Linux reaches a certain level of usability, it has a way of slowly but steadily reshaping industries. In the same way Linux transforms servers, cloud computing, and even desktop environments in unexpected ways, Linux phones are now positioned to influence the future of mobile computing. They may not dominate the market in 2026, but they no longer need to. Their presence alone is enough to make Android and iOS nervous. The real reason Android and iOS should be worried is not market share, but momentum. Linux phones are improving faster than ever, driven by passionate communities rather than quarterly profits. They are aligning perfectly with global trends toward privacy, sustainability, and digital freedom. And once users realize that a phone can be truly theirs, not just something they borrow from a corporation, the idea of going back becomes increasingly uncomfortable. So when we say Linux phones are here in 2026, we are not talking about a future promise. We are talking about a present reality. A reality where choice is expanding, control is returning to users, and the smartphone is once again becoming a personal computer. Android and iOS have dominated for a long time, but for the first time in years, they are no longer the only serious game in town. And that should make them very, very worried.